Welcome to Shatter.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it in a calm voice, like it was a rule she'd already tested on someone else. If I really loved her, I would wait. If I pushed, if I asked, if I noticed the distance, that only proved I didn't understand her boundaries. Touch, she explained, wasn't a right anymore. It was something to be earned back. I didn't answer. I just watched the way she said it, measured and rehearsed, like a line she'd practiced in front of a mirror that wasn't mine. That night, the house felt staged. She curled up on the couch with Hulu running, volume low, the glow washing over her face while she pretended to listen to me talk about a delayed payment schedule at work. I'm a financial controller for a construction firm. I live in consequences. Numbers don't flirt. They don't bluff. They close or they don't. She nodded at the right moments without looking up. By morning, she was already gone. Later I'd see the pattern. Quick exits, vague explanations, coffee meetings that ran long. She started mentioning Duncan the way people mention weather, casual and frequent, like it meant nothing. A quick stop. In and out. No big deal. I didn't accuse her. I don't do scenes. I track exposure. I watch where leverage shifts. A week later, she told me I was being distant. That withholding affection made her feel unsafe. That intimacy needed to be on her terms, otherwise it became pressure. She said all this gently, like she was doing me a favor by explaining how I'd failed. What she didn't say was who had replaced me in the meantime. I knew the guy. Everyone did. Loud. Performative. An event promoter who mistook noise for relevance. The kind of man I'd openly dismissed at dinners because he added nothing but volume to a room. She'd laugh when I did it. Too loudly. That was the point. She hadn't chosen him despite my contempt. She chose him because of it. I realized it sitting alone in my truck, hands on the wheel, engine idling. A Chevy Silverado doesn't pretend to be anything else. It hauls weight or it doesn't move. No aesthetics. No games. She wasn't pulling away to protect herself. She was pulling away to control the field. She thought touch was a button. Delay it long enough, and I'd renegotiate everything else. That was the moment I stopped thinking like a husband. I started thinking like someone preparing an exit. The first confirmation didn't come from her phone. It came from my calendar. We had a standing routine every other Saturday. Costco, early. Bulk groceries, silence. The unspoken agreement that we were still a unit even when we weren't talking much. That Saturday passed without a word from her. No excuse. No rain check. Just absence. When I asked later, she said she'd needed space. Said routines made her feel boxed in. Said intimacy couldn't survive obligation. She delivered it like a thesis, not a confession. I didn't challenge it. I opened my laptop instead. At work, I'm paid to notice patterns before they become losses. I review contracts for risk exposure, exit clauses, quiet liabilities that look harmless until they compound. Marriage uses different language, but the structure is the same. Inputs change. Behavior shifts. Someone starts hedging. Her spending didn't spike. That would have been sloppy. It smoothed out instead, redistributed. Smaller charges, unfamiliar timing. Nothing illegal, just deliberate. Like she was careful not to leave fingerprints. The real tell was her tone. She stopped negotiating. Everything became a statement. When I mentioned distance, she reframed it as my impatience. When I asked where she'd been, she turned it into a conversation about trust. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was repositioning. I pictured him without trying to. The event promoter with the loud laugh and the soft hands. The one she used to roll her eyes at after parties. I remembered saying once that men like him borrowed importance from rooms they didn't build. She'd kissed me for that comment. Harder than usual. That memory settled something. She wasn't drifting into an affair. She was making a point. Withholding touch to provoke pursuit. Then replacing me with someone I'd openly dismissed. Not because she wanted him, but because she wanted me to feel interchangeable. That night, she fell asleep to background noise from Hulu again, curled away from me like proximity itself had become a negotiation chip. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, cataloging assets instead of feelings. By morning, I'd already decided not to ask questions that gave her control. I stopped initiating conversation. Not cold, not angry, just neutral. I watched how quickly discomfort replaced confidence when she realized I wasn't reaching anymore. She tested boundaries by tightening them. More distance. Sharper rules. less access. She didn't notice that I'd started preparing for a version of my life where her terms no longer mattered. And once I saw the game clearly, the outcome stopped being emotional. It became procedural. That's when silence stopped being a reaction. It became a strategy. The proof didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as confirmation. One evening she came home late, energized in a way that had nothing to do with me. Her voice carried a lightness I hadn't heard in months. She talked about a gallery installation, about people who understood timing. She didn't mention names. She didn't have to. She showered longer than usual, humming, letting the water run like she was washing something off. When she walked past me afterward, wrapped in a towel, she didn't slow down. No pause. No glance. Just absence, sharpened into intention. That was when I understood the real mechanism. She wasn't punishing me for wanting her. She was conditioning me to accept less. Touch had become currency. Delay it long enough, and the other side starts offering concessions just to feel normal again. She expected me to negotiate. Instead, I started inventory. I reviewed joint accounts the way I review corporate exposure. Clean. No surprises. She hadn't crossed legal lines. She didn't need to. Power plays rarely do. They rely on assumption, not theft. The man she chose was deliberate. The loud promoter with the cheap confidence and the borrowed circles. He wasn't a threat. He was a message. She knew I found him empty. That's why he was perfect. Every time she touched him, it was meant to echo back to me as humiliation. She wanted reaction. I gave her routine. I stopped joining her on the couch while Hulu played in the background. Stopped commenting on her schedule. Stopped checking when she came home. I wasn't sulking. I was disengaging. There's a difference. She noticed. Not immediately, but gradually, like someone realizing the air pressure had changed. She started tightening rules again. More talk about boundaries. About how desire worked better when it wasn't expected. She framed it like wisdom. Like I should be grateful she was explaining it to me. I listened. I always listen. Then, one afternoon, I drove to Lowe's on my way home from work. I bought boxes. Heavy-duty ones. Locks. Nothing dramatic. No rush. Just preparation. When I loaded them into the truck, I felt calm. Not relief. Alignment. She still thought intimacy was leverage. That she could pull it away, then release it strategically to reset the balance. What she didn't see was that I'd stopped valuing the asset she was manipulating. And once something loses its leverage, it becomes irrelevant. That was the moment I stopped waiting for proof. I already had enough. I didn't announce anything. That would have turned it into a negotiation. I waited for a weekday morning when she left early, the kind of rushed exit she'd normalized. She'd grabbed her bag, mentioned a quick stop at Dunkin', and kissed the air near my cheek without touching it. That was her version of balance now. Enough to avoid suspicion. Not enough to mean anything. As soon as her car disappeared, I started moving. Boxes from Lowe's came out of the garage first. I worked methodically, the way I do when closing a complicated file. No music. No pauses. Just decisions. Personal items went into labeled boxes. Shared items went into neutral ones. Anything that carried history but no function stayed behind. Memory doesn't get priority in an exit. By noon, I'd separated accounts. Not frozen. Not dramatic. Just clean lines. Automatic payments rerouted. Access changed. I didn't block her yet. That would have been premature. I wanted the silence to land before the explanation. I loaded what mattered into the truck. It took one trip. That felt important. Before leaving, I walked through the house once more. The living room still smelled like her candles. The couch still held the indentation where she spent evenings scrolling while Hulu murmured to no one. It looked exactly like a life continuing without me. I left the keys on the counter. I didn't text. I didn't call. I drove to a short-term rental across town and checked in under my own name. No secrecy, just distance. By evening, my phone started vibrating. Missed calls at first. Then messages. Not apologies. Questions framed as confusion. She wanted to understand what was happening, as if nothing irreversible had already started. I didn't open them. The next day, I logged out of shared accounts. Photos disappeared from my profile. Tags removed. I exited group chats without explanation. No posts. No statements. Digital erasure is more unsettling than confrontation. There's nothing to argue with. She escalated quickly after that. More calls. Longer messages. A tone shift from control to concern. She wasn't panicking yet. She still believed this was a phase. I watched it all from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. She thought withholding touch would bring me back to center. What she didn't anticipate was how quiet it would get once I stopped showing up altogether, and how irreversible silence becomes once it's chosen. Her tone changed on the third day. The messages stopped circling confusion and moved straight into urgency. She said she didn't understand how things had escalated so fast. She said space wasn't abandonment. She said I was overreacting to something that hadn't been fully explained yet. That word stood out. Explained. As if context could reverse consequences. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded everything to my attorney. Not because I was angry, because timing matters. Emotion clouds sequence. Process doesn't. The paperwork moved faster than she expected. Separation of accounts was already done. The notification came from a third party, not me. Formal language. Neutral tone. No accusations. Just facts and next steps. That's when panic finally showed. She drove to the rental I was staying in. I knew because the front desk called to ask if I was expecting a visitor. I said no. She waited in the parking lot for an hour. I watched from the window without being seen. She looked smaller outside of the environment she controlled. Later that night, she sent a message that tried a different angle. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd felt unseen, that she'd needed reassurance I wasn't giving. She didn't deny the affair. She reframed it, claimed it was never about him, that it had been about power dynamics between us. That part was true. She thought naming the game would reset it. I thought about all the weekends we used to spend at Costco, pushing the same cart, buying for a future she'd already started leveraging against me. I realized I'd stepped out of that future before she noticed the ground shifting. The next morning, I posted the listing. Craigslist is brutally honest. Square footage. Rent. Availability. No sentiment. No backstory. I uploaded photos of the apartment we'd shared and wrote a clean description. Move-in ready. Immediate occupancy. By afternoon, inquiries were coming in. She called again after that. Not angry. Not pleading. Controlled, like she was recalibrating. She said we needed to talk before things went too far. That intimacy could be rebuilt if I slowed down. That was the moment she ran out of leverage. She still believed touch was a bargaining chip. What she didn't understand was that I'd already closed the position. There was nothing left to renegotiate. And for the first time, the silence wasn't something she imposed. It was something she couldn't penetrate. The shift became visible before it became loud. It showed up in small places first. Mutual acquaintances stopped asking how we were doing. Invitations softened, then disappeared. People adjust quickly when a structure collapses without drama. There's nothing to gather around. She started showing up alone. I heard about it indirectly. A friend from work mentioned seeing her at a group event, animated but slightly off rhythm, like she was overperforming for an audience that had already clocked the change. The promoter was there too, louder than ever. He filled space the way insecure people do when they sense attention slipping. That pairing didn't elevate her the way she'd expected. It diluted her. The contrast was too sharp. The art curator with the controlled silences, standing next to a man whose relevance depended on noise. People didn't judge out loud. They didn't need to. Social systems correct themselves quietly. She tried to stabilize by leaning into familiarity. I noticed a charge from Costco on a shared account she'd forgotten I still monitored during the final audit window. Old habits reach for old anchors when pressure rises. I removed my access an hour later. The next attempt bounced. That's when she finally understood this wasn't about punishment. She sent a longer message that night. Not defensive this time. Reflective. She said she felt exposed. That people were looking at her differently. That the narrative wasn't under her control anymore. She asked if I could at least tell her what I was thinking. I didn't answer. At home, or what used to be home, she kept Hulu running at night like background insulation. Noise to push back against the quiet. Episodes stacked up unwatched. The house had become a waiting room without a doctor. The promoter didn't last. He was useful as long as I was reacting. Once I wasn't, he had no function. Provocation only works if someone's still on the other end. She reached out to my sister next. Then a mutual friend. Then an old colleague of mine she'd never liked. That's when it crossed from strategy into desperation. Everyone gave her the same response. Polite distance. No alignment. She wasn't being excluded. She was being recalibrated out of relevance. And through all of it, I stayed absent. No statements. No corrections. No visible emotion. Control doesn't announce itself. It just stops responding. By the time she realized the social floor had shifted beneath her, there was nothing left to grab. And for the first time, she wasn't waiting for touch. She was waiting for silence to end. It didn't. She finally broke the pattern by showing up where she knew I'd be. It wasn't dramatic. No tears. No raised voice. She waited outside my office building near the end of the day, leaning against a concrete barrier like someone trying to look accidental. I saw her through the glass before she saw me. That half-second mattered. I didn't change direction. I didn't slow down. When she spoke, it was measured, almost professional. She said she needed clarity. Said the silence had gone too far. Said adults didn't resolve things by disappearing. She framed it as concern for me, which was familiar. Control often wears empathy when it's failing. I told her nothing. Not because I didn't have words. Because words reopened systems I'd already closed. She followed me to the truck, her steps uneven now. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. That I'd become cold. That intimacy wasn't supposed to be transactional, and that I was proving her right by treating the marriage like a spreadsheet. She missed the irony completely. I got in and drove away. That night, she sent messages in a new tone. Shorter, sharper. She accused me of punishing her, of enjoying the imbalance. She said withholding presence was just another form of control. That was the closest she came to understanding. I spent that weekend finishing what I'd started. The last of my things were already boxed. A final stop at Lowe's for a new lock, installed quietly, without ceremony. Not to keep her out. To mark an end. I noticed how light everything felt once the physical ties were gone. No background noise. No waiting for moods to shift. Just space. She tried to recreate urgency by collapsing. Missed work. Missed events. Friends noticed. Concern circulated. But concern doesn't translate into leverage. It just creates distance. The promoter vanished from the picture entirely. Without my reaction, he'd become unnecessary. He was never competition. He was a prop. Once the scene ended, he was cleared off stage. Late one night, she sent a final message. Not long. Not dramatic. She said she finally understood what she'd done. That she'd mistaken patience for weakness. That she wanted to start over, slowly, on equal ground. I read it once. Then I archived the thread. There are moments when confrontation feels like closure. This wasn't one of them. Closure had already happened in silence, days earlier, when I stopped responding and didn't feel the urge to start again. Isolation isn't loud when it's earned. It's quiet, and it settles in permanently. The confrontation didn't happen where she expected. It wasn't at the house, not at my office, not even through messages. It happened in a neutral place, stripped of emotion, where leverage doesn't echo. She requested a meeting through the attorney, not to argue terms, to talk. She framed it as closure. That word again. People reach for it when control slips through their fingers. I agreed to attend, but I didn't prepare anything to say. She arrived early. I arrived on time. That difference mattered. She looked composed in the way people do when they've rehearsed restraint. Controlled posture. Calm breathing. The version of herself she used in galleries when donors hovered too close. She spoke carefully, in third-person explanations about what had gone wrong between us. About misalignment. About timing. About how desire shouldn't be rushed or demanded. She said she'd never meant to hurt me. She said intimacy wasn't a weapon. She said she'd been testing safety, not power. I let the silence stretch between her sentences. Not as punishment. As a mirror. When she finally asked what I wanted, I told her nothing. That unsettled her more than anger would have. She leaned forward slightly, searching for reaction, for signal. Her eyes moved the way they used to when she was gauging whether withholding had worked. I stayed still. She said we could rebuild slowly. That touch could return when trust did. That she was ready to renegotiate the terms, now that she understood the stakes. That was the moment everything crystallized. She still thought access was currency. She still believed proximity could be scheduled. I told her I'd already closed the account. Not emotionally. Structurally. I stood up before she could respond. The meeting ended without escalation. No raised voices. No final statements. Just an absence where she expected engagement. Later that night, I drove past the old place without stopping. The lights were on. Hulu flickered through the window, filling rooms with noise that no one was listening to. The house looked occupied, but hollow. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. That's what she hadn't understood. This wasn't about winning. It was about no longer participating. She had traded intimacy like a bargaining chip, believing it could always be withdrawn and reintroduced for effect. What she never considered was that leverage expires when the other side exits the system entirely. By the time she realized there would be no more meetings, no more explanations, no final emotional release, the silence had already settled into permanence. And permanence doesn't argue back. The collapse didn't come all at once. It arrived in fragments, spaced just far enough apart to make denial impossible. I heard about it indirectly. That's how these things surface when you're no longer in the center of the blast radius. A missed opening at the gallery. A fundraiser she didn't get invited back to. People who used to orbit her attention suddenly finding reasons to be elsewhere. Status doesn't disappear loudly. It erodes. She started posting again. Nothing explicit. Just presence. Carefully framed moments meant to signal stability. Coffee cups on tables, half smiles, curated normalcy. I recognized the rhythm from years of watching her manage perception. What she couldn't manage anymore was response. The engagement wasn't there. At night, she stayed home more. I knew because someone mentioned seeing the lights on. The familiar glow of Hulu spilling through windows like insulation against a quiet she couldn't escape. Background noise where conversation used to live. The promoter never reappeared. He'd served his purpose and been discarded, the way tools are when they stop applying pressure. Without me to react, he had nothing to amplify. She tried once more to reach sideways. A mutual friend mentioned she'd asked how I was doing, phrased carefully, as if casual curiosity might reopen a channel. The answer she got was accurate and useless. Fine. Busy. Moved on. That was the part she couldn't process. She had built her leverage on the assumption that I would always want access more than resolution. That desire would outlast respect. That proximity was inevitable. Instead, she was left with empty rooms and memories that arrived uninvited. Small things started cutting deeper than confrontations ever could. Standing in line at Dunkin' alone, realizing no one was waiting on the other end. Passing aisles at Costco without a shared list, without a future implied by bulk purchases. Those flashes didn't break her all at once. They accumulated. By the time the legal finalization came through, it felt anticlimactic. Paperwork has no emotion. It just confirms what behavior already decided. I didn't attend any final meeting. There was nothing to witness. The last I heard, she'd taken time off. Claimed burnout. Claimed reflection. The words didn't matter. What mattered was the absence of an audience. I never reached out. Not to check in. Not to clarify. Not to soften the landing. This wasn't punishment. It was consequence. She had mistaken intimacy for a button, something she could press and release to shape outcomes. What she learned, too late, was that leverage only works while the system is still running. I had already shut it down. The quiet didn't fade. It settled. Months passed without incident, which was the point. No dramatic rebound. No public reinvention. Just days that stacked cleanly, unremarkable in the way stability always is. I moved into a smaller place closer to work. Nothing temporary. Nothing shared. Mine. I kept my routines tight. Mornings early. Coffee black. Evenings quiet. No background noise competing for attention. When I needed something practical, I went to Lowe's once more, replaced a lock, fixed a hinge, finished what I'd started. Maintenance, not transition. She didn't reach out again. I heard she tried to explain what happened to a few people, framing it as a mutual drift. A misunderstanding of needs. An experiment that went too far. The story didn't spread. Explanations lose power when there's no counter-narrative. I never corrected it. What surprised me wasn't how quickly she disappeared from my life. It was how quickly the tension did. The low-grade pressure of being evaluated, negotiated, delayed. I hadn't realized how much bandwidth it consumed until it was gone. One evening, driving home, I passed the old neighborhood again without noticing at first. Muscle memory. I took a different turn without thinking. That's how you know something's over. Not when it hurts less, but when it stops registering at all. She had believed intimacy was leverage. A way to stall, redirect, extract concessions. She thought desire guaranteed engagement. That patience would keep me at the table no matter how the terms shifted. What she never understood was that leverage only functions when both sides still want the deal. I didn't disappear. I didn't need to. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. There was no final speech, no victory moment, no lesson delivered to her directly. The system closed without ceremony, the way all efficient things do. Somewhere along the way, she realized there would be no reopening conversation, no delayed reward, no moment where withholding could be reversed for effect. By the time she reached for that lever again, it wasn't connected to anything. The outcome wasn't revenge. It was irrelevance. And that silence she couldn't stand in the end wasn't something I created to punish her. It was what remained once I chose myself and walked away without looking back. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.